What if I told you that a single invention no larger than a man's thumb decided the fate of entire battles? World War II wasn't just fought with courage and steel, it was fought with invention. In secret laboratories, in makeshift bunkers, even inside university basements, scientists and soldiers were racing against time and against death to re-engineer the very art of destruction. For the first time in history, war became a laboratory. Equations replaced guesswork, radar waves met gunpowder, circuits met steel. And out of that collision of fear and genius came 5 inventions that changed artillery forever. Each one redefined what it meant to fight and what it meant to survive. From a fuse that could think, to rockets that could scream, to a gun so massive it needed an army just to pull its trigger, this is the story of how science turned the tide of war. But which mattered more, the bravery of men or the brilliance of the machines they built? Comment below, would you trust courage or technology to win your war? It started with a secret meeting, one so important it would change how every shell in the war would fly. In the summer of 1940, as Britain stood alone against Germany's bombers, a small group of British scientists crossed the Atlantic carrying something the world had never seen before. Not gold, not weapons, but ideas. They called it the Tizard mission. Inside, their crates were blueprints, prototypes, and one fragile concept that could turn artillery from a guessing game into a precision instrument, the proximity fuse. At that time, anti-aircraft gunners were fighting a losing battle. They fired thousands of shells for every aircraft they brought down. The sky was chaos, black smoke, shrapnel, near misses. But near wasn't enough. Every miss wasted time, ammunition, and lives. So, the idea was daring. What if the shell could sense when it was close to its target and explode on its own? Not on impact. Not by timer, but by pure intelligence. That concept was more science fiction than science until it reached American hands. When the British shared the secret, the U.S. National Defense Research Committee immediately assigned it to a new team, Section T, led by a quiet, determined physicist named Merle Tuve. His challenge? Shrink a radar system, an entire transmitter, receiver, power source, and antenna into the nose of an artillery shell that would spin thousands of times per second and survive 20,000 Gs of force. Think about that. The moment a shell leaves the barrel, it accelerates faster than any human-made object of its time. Electronics shatter, circuits die, wires melt. And yet, they had to make it think. Tuve and his team created a masterpiece of miniaturization. They built a tiny continuous wave radar that pulsed energy forward. When that wave bounced back from an aircraft, the signal interfered with its own transmission, like 2 notes clashing in perfect timing. When the interference reached a critical point, a gas-filled thyrotron triggered the detonator. The shell exploded mid-air right next to the target, a self-aware weapon, the first of its kind. Power came from a glass reserve battery that activated only after the shell was fired. Ingenious, because any vibration before launch would have destroyed it. The entire body of the shell became the antenna. And to everyone's surprise, it worked. By early 1943, the first proximity fuses were fitted into naval anti-aircraft shells aboard the USS Helena. The results were devastating, not for the Allies, but for enemy aircraft. Their accuracy improved by 5 to 10 times. Pilots who once could weave through flak now found the air itself exploding around them. Then came the Battle of Britain's second storm, the German V-1 flying bombs. Small, fast, hard to hit. But when proximity-fused shells entered the fight, Britain's kill rate rose from 24% to 79% in just 2 months. For the first time, defense had teeth. Still, the fuse was considered too valuable for ground combat. If one shell fell into enemy hands, its secrets could be copied. So for years, Soldiers watched it used at sea, never on land. That changed in the Battle of the Bulge. Desperate times overruled caution. The order was given, use the fuse. When artillery shells exploded above German infantry instead of in front of them, it was like lightning had learned where to strike. Soldiers said it was the most terrifying barrage they'd ever faced. No cover was safe. Trees became shrapnel. Snow turned red. General George S. Patton himself wrote that the proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge. And he wasn't exaggerating. It cut waste, increased accuracy, and forced the enemy to change tactics overnight. Every burst was no longer random, it was personal. The invention remained classified until 1954. By then, it had quietly shaped the future of warfare. Every guided missile, every radar-guided shell, every modern smart weapon traces its roots back to that moment when scientists taught a bullet to think. Would you have trusted something that could explode just by sensing its target, or would you rather fire blind, like the gunners of old? Comment below, instinct or invention. Which would you choose in war? By 1940, the world's fastest armies were being slowed by their own firepower. Artillery, the king of battle, was powerful, yes, but painfully slow. Each gun had to be unhitched, leveled, aimed, fired, and then hitched back up to move again. By the time a battery was ready to shoot, the front line might already have changed. And in modern war, standing still meant dying. The problem was, simple tanks could race, infantry could ride, but artillery crawled. So the solution came in steel: mount the guns on the same chassis as the tanks they supported. It sounds obvious now, but in the early 1940s, this was revolutionary. It changed not only how artillery moved, but how it fought. The American experiment began with the M7 Priest, a 105mm howitzer bolted onto an M3 Lee later, the famous Sherman tank chassis. It was ugly, loud, and exposed, but it could move with the armor columns, fire within minutes, and reposition before the enemy could respond. They called it shoot and scoot. That one idea would save countless lives. As Patton's divisions tore across North Africa and Italy, priests rolled with them, steel churches, delivering sermons of thunder. Each battery could cover advancing infantry, hit hidden bunkers, or crush ambushes long before they were seen. For the first time, artillery wasn't lagging behind, it was leading the charge. Across the battlefield, the Germans took the same idea to darker perfection. Their engineers mounted heavy guns on tank hulls, the Hummel, the Wesper, the Grill, and the most feared of all, the Sturmgeschütz III, the Stug. The Stug began as infantry support, a simple gun on a Panzer III body, but the war transformed it. As German tanks grew scarce, Stugs became tank destroyers, ambushing from woods, city ruins, and ridgelines. Low, fast, deadly. They knocked out enemy armor for a fraction of the cost of a full tank. By 1944, there were more Stugs than Panzers. It wasn't elegance that Germany needed, it was numbers, and the Stug delivered. But not all armies wanted complexity. The Soviets built the Su-76, a crude, boxy, open-topped machine, cheap enough to flood the front. It was no beauty. It was noisy, cramped, and often leaked exhaust into the crew compartment, yet soldiers loved it. Why? Because it worked. It could support infantry 1 hour, then blow holes through enemy fortifications the next. It was simplicity turned into power, a Soviet signature. Each nation learned the same lesson in its own language: mobility equals survival. Self-propelled guns changed the very rhythm of warfare. They followed tanks through mud, snow, and fire. No horses, no trucks, no delays. They fired, moved, and fired again. And when counter-battery fire came, when the enemy's radar locked on, they were already gone. They blurred the line between tank and cannon. Crews fought inside armored coffins that offered both safety and claustrophobia. You could hear the steel vibrate as shells fired, smell the cordite, feel the tracks grind beneath your boots, and know that you were part of something new, a mobile, mechanical symphony of fire. By the war's end, the Allies and Soviets had produced over 200,000 tanks and self-propelled guns combined. Mass production, streamlined parts, and shared chassis meant easier repairs, faster supply lines, and fewer breakdowns. The world's armies had discovered the secret to industrial war: standardize, mobilize, mechanize. The battlefield would never go back to stillness again. The doctrine of shoot and move became the heartbeat of every modern army. If you were behind that steel plate, if you had to choose, would you rather have the armor of a tank or the reach of artillery? Comment below mobility or firepower, which wins the battle. It's easy to imagine artillery as brute force barrels, shells, explosions, but behind every blast in World War II, there was math. And behind that math, a room full of men with pencils, charts, and nerves of steel. This was the Fire Direction Center, the secret brain of every artillery battalion. Before the war, each gun crew worked almost alone. They calculated their own ranges, guessed wind drift, and prayed their shells would land where they were supposed to. It was slow, it was messy, and when dozens of guns fired independently, chaos followed. So, in the late 1930s, at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, an officer named Carlos Brewer had a radical idea. What if all the thinking, the numbers, the calculations, the corrections could happen in one central place? One brain directing many hands. That idea changed artillery forever. By the time America entered the war, every battalion had its own Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Inside, maps were spread across long tables. Rulers, compasses, and firing tables covered every inch. Officers calculated range, azimuth, elevation, propellant charge, temperature, air pressure, and altitude, every factor that could shift a shell's path. They turned the chaos of combat into geometry. They turned fear into precision. The FDC became the orchestra conductor of destruction, every gun, every battery, every division firing not by instinct, but by mathematics. But the real magic came with a tactic the British had pioneered in North Africa, the time-on-target barrage. It sounded simple, but required near-perfect coordination. Different guns, firing from different places, at different distances, all timed so their shells hit simultaneously. Imagine it, dozens of explosions striking one position at the exact same second. No warning whistles, no time to run, just instant, synchronized chaos. To make that possible, FDCs calculated the time each shell would take to travel its distance, the time of flight, and synchronized clocks across all batteries. Every gun fired at a precise second, staggered by fractions of a moment, so all impacts converged together. It was terrifyingly effective and breathtakingly disciplined. During the Battle of the Bulge, this system reached its peak. At Elsenborn Ridge, 3 entire divisions, a single Fire Direction Center, coordinated 129 guns. The result was devastating. German attacks broke apart before they even reached the line. By war's end, up to 60% of all German casualties inflicted by US forces came from artillery, not rifle, not tanks. Artillery had become the deadliest weapon on the field, because of the brains behind the guns. But there was another layer to this revolution: safety. The FDC reduced friendly fire by verifying every gun's position, every coordinate, every range. It was not just more deadly, it was smarter. Officers learned that precision saved lives, both theirs and the men depending on them. In those cramped, smoky command tents, they didn't just aim guns, they sculpted the battlefield. By 1945, the Fire Direction Center had become the beating heart of Allied artillery. It turned scattered batteries into a single thinking machine, one mind guiding hundreds of barrels. The lessons learned there would echo through every future war, forming the basis for modern computerized fire control systems. The men who once worked by slide rule and stopwatch had built the first analog brain of the battlefield. If you had to trust one, would it be the raw instinct of a gunner or the calm precision of a mathematician under fire? Comment below courage or calculation, which truly wins a war. Before World War II, rockets were toys, experiments, curiosities left to dreamers and scientists. By 1942, they had become weapons of terror. For the first time in human history, the battlefield screamed, and that scream had a name. The Germans called theirs the Nebelwerfer, smoke thrower. The Soviets called theirs the Katyusha. But soldiers in the field gave them darker nicknames: Moaning Minnie, Stalin's organ. Both sides had invented a new kind of artillery, one that didn't whisper, didn't hide, didn't miss quietly. These weapons howled, flashed, and struck like a sudden thunderstorm. The Katyusha BM-13 was the Soviet answer to mobility and shock. Mounted on trucks, each launcher could unleash 16 or more rockets in just 10 seconds. A single battery could drop 4 tons of explosives across a wide area. It wasn't precise. It didn't have to be. Its power lay in chaos, in the rain of fire that smothered entire German positions. When a barrage began, the earth shook, the air roared, and even hardened veterans froze in fear. Those who survived said it sounded like the sky itself was tearing apart. That's how the weapon earned its name, Stalin's organ. Because when it fired, it sang a mechanical wail of death echoing across the steppe. On the other side, the Germans answered with the Nebelwerfer 41. 6 barrels, 15 centimeters each. Later models doubled in size. Its job? Deliver massive, fast salvos of smoke, gas, or high explosives. It was simple, cheap, and deadly. When fired, it gave off a distinctive shriek, a howl that soldiers described as like a woman screaming. The sound was unmistakable. That's how Allied troops named it, the Moaning Minnie. Both systems shared a truth. They were not about accuracy, but effect. They didn't pick off a tank, they erased the field around it. They were made to break morale, not just bodies. The German tactic placed Nebelwerfers close to the front to support infantry or seal defensive gaps, but their signature smoke and flame made them easy targets. Crews often had to flee immediately after firing to avoid counter-battery fire, shoot then vanish. The Soviets, meanwhile, turned the Katyusha into a national symbol. By 1945, they had built over 10,000 launchers and millions of rockets. Factories across the Soviet Union churned them out on every truck they could find, from ZIS 6 seconds to Lend-Lease Studebakers. They called the rocket troops Guards mortar units. To the Red Army, these were not just weapons, they were instruments of vengeance. When Soviet offensives began, thousands of Katyushas fired in unison. The first salvo wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to stun, to paralyze every nerve before the real artillery began. German survivors recalled the moments before the barrage hit, a whistling crescendo, a chorus of horror that made men drop their weapons and cover their ears. Then the fire came. It was psychological warfare at its purest form, sound as a weapon, but both the Nebelwerfer and the Katyusha had flaws. Reloading was slow, accuracy was poor, and after each launch, the smoke trail gave away their position instantly. Yet those weaknesses didn't matter. The effect, the fear, was priceless. Troops often mistook rocket salvos for airstrikes. The noise alone broke morale faster than bullets. By the end of the war, even Western observers understood. Rockets were no longer toys. They were the future. Every modern multiple rocket launcher, from the American MLRS to today's HIMARS, carries the DNA of those first screaming monsters. They were crude, they were terrifying, they were unforgettable, and they left one haunting truth sometimes: fear itself is the most powerful weapon of all. If you stood in the open field, hearing that rising howl in the distance, would you run or stand your ground? It was the ultimate contradiction of World War II, the belief that if a big gun could win a battle, then the biggest gun could win the war. What Germany built next wasn't a weapon. It was a monument to power, pride, and futility. They called it the Schwerer Gustav, an 800mm railway cannon designed to smash through the fortresses of Europe. It was a weapon so massive that even its nickname, Heavy Gustav, sounded like understatement. Imagine a gun taller than a house, heavier than a battleship turret, and firing shells that weighed 7 tons each. It could hurl those steel monsters almost 50 kilometers, tearing through 7 meters of reinforced concrete. To Hitler, this was proof that German engineering could outdo the world. To the men who operated it was both awe and agony. Built by Krupp in the late 1930s, Gustav was meant to destroy the French Maginot Line, but by the time it was ready, France had already fallen. The gun was too late for its own war. So, the Germans moved it east to Sevastopol in 1942. There, its thunder rolled across Crimea. Its shells shattered bunkers, fuel depots, and underground ammunition stores. But each shot came at a price. 30 rail cars were needed just to move its parts, 1,000 men to prepare the site, 4,500 personnel to assemble, aim, and protect it. Even cranes had to be custom-built just to lift its ammunition. Every time Gustav fired, the entire hillside shook, and yet its effect was minimal. For all its power, it could only hit fixed targets, ones the enemy had long abandoned or buried deeper. It was a weapon that demanded the world just to shoot once. Firing rate, 1 shell every half hour. Barrel life, only 48 shots before it had to be replaced. Engineers realized what soldiers already knew. By the time Gustav was ready to fire, the war had already moved somewhere else. To keep it safe from Allied bombers, anti-aircraft units surrounded it. Entire battalions existed just to protect a single gun. It was as if an empire had been built around one trigger. There was a second monster too, Dora, Gustav's sister gun. Equally massive, equally impractical. They were the last of their kind, the final echo of an age when size was mistaken for strength. As the war went on, air power replaced firepower. Bombers could do what Gustav could never dream of: destroy targets miles away, faster and cheaper. Mobility had replaced magnitude, and in that moment, the great German supergun became obsolete, a steel dinosaur in a jet age. But the men who built and served it weren't fools. They were engineers chasing a vision that human genius could bend even physics to will. The tragedy was not in their failure, but in their purpose. For all its marvel, Gustav stood as a monument to a dark truth. In war, brilliance and madness often share the same blueprint. After Sevastopol, the great gun was disassembled, hidden, and later destroyed to prevent capture. No one would ever build its like again. Because in the end, the lesson was clear. Size could impress, but it couldn't win. From Gustav's thunder to the whisper of a radar fuse, World War II had shown both extremes of human invention. One changed the war, the other became a warning. If you were in charge, would you build a giant weapon to terrify or a smart weapon to outthink? Comment below brute force or precision. Which would you trust to decide a war? 5 inventions, 1 war rewritten. War has a way of accelerating intellect. It forces shortcuts, bright ideas, and dangerous experiments into the open. In laboratories, in factories, on muddy battlefields, ingenuity met necessity. The result was brutal, brilliant, and ambiguous. The proximity fuse taught metal to think. It turned near misses into kills and saved ships, cities, and lives, but it also made the sky itself lethal in a new way. Self-propelled guns dissolved the gap between movement and fire. They freed artillery from the hitching post and made support instant, but they also birthed armored coffins for crews who rode into danger. The Fire Direction Center turned geometry into death. It made battles predictable, surgical, and efficient, and it made math the deadliest instrument on the field. Rocket salvos weaponized sound and terror. They smashed morale the way artillery smashed earth and proved that sometimes fear matters more than accuracy. Gustav and Dora showed the limits of pride. They were engineering wonders that devoured men and material to fire a single shell proof that size can be spectacle, not strategy. These inventions were not moral absolutes. Each solved a problem and created a new one. Each saved lives and took them. Each was a triumph and a warning. Science had learned how to kill better, faster, and smarter. Humanity had learned how to depend on machines in ways it never had before. So where does that leave us? Was the fuse that saved convoys worth the decades of escalation it helped begin? Did the roar of rocket salvos that broke an enemy's will justify the terror they inflicted? Is building ever larger weapons an expression of genius or the shadow of desperation? There are no tidy answers, only consequences. The legacy of World War II's artillery is not just in museums or rusted tracks. It lives in every modern battlefield decision. It lives in the code of targeting systems, the doctrine of mobility, the architecture of command centers, and the psychology of fear. We learned to aim better. We learned to move faster. We learned to synchronize destruction to the second. And we learned that with each lesson comes a price. History teaches by contrast. It shows us what worked and what became obsolete. It shows us the human cost behind inventions that, on paper, look like progress. If war is a mirror for technology, then what we see is complicated, a reflection of our brightest minds and our deepest failures. So, which of these inventions truly changed World War II? Was it the tiny fuse that thought, the mobile gun that kept pace with armor, the brain that synchronized barrages, the scream of thousands of rockets, or the terrifying folly of a gun that needed an army to fire? Tell me below, pick one. Which changed the war for better or worse? Which was genius and which was folly? If you found this dive useful, hit subscribe and ring the bell. If you want a deep dive on any one of these five, the engineering, the men who built them, or the battles they decided, say which one, and I'll expand it into a full episode. Thank you for watching. And remember, innovation can save a life, but in war, it also redraws the line between protector and destroyer. So, was the proximity fuse truly the game changer, or was timing and doctrine the real winner? Tell me below.